And now I'd like to introduce today's keynote, Morningstar Gali. Morningstar Gali is a member of the Ajumawi band of Pit River Tribe, located in northeastern California. Ms. Gali serves as the California Tribal and Community Liaison for the International Indian Treaty Council, working for the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous peoples and the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights, treaties, traditional cultures, and sacred lands. She's a tribal water policy organizer for Save California Salmon and has worked as a regional network weaver for Native Americans in philanthropy. Ms. Gali is also a 2013 graduate of Native Americans in Philanthropy's Circle of Leadership Academy. She is a 2019 Open Society Institute Racial Equity Fellow, Funders for Justice Fellow from 2018 to 2021, and a 2016 to 2018 Rosenberg Foundation Leading Edge Fellow, focusing on the disproportionate impact of the criminal and juvenile justice system on Native Americans. Between 2012 and 2016, Ms. Gali previously worked as a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pit River Tribe and continues to lead large-scale actions while helping organize Native culture, spiritual, scholarly, and political gatherings throughout California. Please join me in welcoming Morningstar Gali to the podium.
Chimisanui. Good afternoon to everyone. I want to begin by acknowledging the land, ancestors, and living people of this territory. As Canyon mentioned, Yalamu, home to the Ramatash Ohlone peoples. I give that acknowledgement and respect to the living Ohlone peoples and the struggles that they are constantly fighting on a daily basis. I also give that acknowledgement as a California Indigenous woman, and it is so important to do so because on a daily basis, we are not only fighting a battle against continued colonization and genocide of our peoples, but we are fighting a battle for a greater visibility and against the erasure of who we are. Every day we are fighting to remind non-Native people that we still exist on our sacred lands today, and that there is a narrative that has been told from one dominant perspective for far too long. And in our presence and our everyday actions, it is our responsibility to shift that narrative and to tell the truth in our rich and complex histories and our current living stories. So with that, I say hello and thank you for this opportunity to stand here with all of you. It is truly an honor to stand in community today to honor the deep and long-standing commitment that was made 50 years ago by many of our direct relatives. Today, I want to talk about a time 50 years ago that we were fighting for our survival when everyone was under attack. Because here we are in this moment, in the face of climate change, mass incarceration, state violence, and criminalized migration, where we must once again fight for our survival. In that spirit, I will quote my late father, Cesar Gali. He was a proud Indigenous man and Third World Liberation Front freedom fighter who struggled right here on this campus and shed blood on these grounds. We know that our strength is when we organize. I'm going to ask you to say that all with me. We know our strength is when we organize.
We know our strength is when we organize.
And as I raise my 4 children, I raise them with the values of interdependence and love of our communities, just as I have been raised. I was born across the great waters of the San Francisco Bay in a little town called Oakland, California, at a time that Highland Hospital, the county hospital, had the 2nd highest infant mortality rate in the nation. And it was in that time that forced sterilization of Native women, particularly on reservations, but throughout the Indian healthcare system, was just coming to light. Because of this, my mother and father decided not to risk delivering me in the hospital, and I was the first baby, the first home birth that took place in the basement of the American Indian Movement Survival School. This was on the concrete corner of East 27th and Foothill Boulevard in Oakland. What's been recounted to me with countless variations by relatives in attendance The story of my birth is always full of love and community and support of the intention to birth me in the traditional way that Indigenous women have been birthing for thousands of years and still continue to do so. At the Aim for Freedom Survival School, there was a daily sweat lodge fire, sweat ceremonies, and a gathering of Native people at 5 a.m. that offered tobacco to make these prior offerings for our continued way of life and resistance. I'm told that it was within minutes one morning of prayer that I was born at 4:45 a.m. and introduced to that sacred fire. I was introduced to this land and our relatives outside in a spiritual way that even back home on the reservation is not always accessible to women birthing. Particularly because of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, a victory achieved through the organizing of AIM and through the efforts of Third World Liberation Front. It was passed a year prior. And my father, who had been incarcerated for 7 years at San Quentin and later returned to the prison as a Native chaplain who worked on death row to offer ceremonial healing for other Indigenous people imprisoned, where he had been an inmate, after the passage of ERFA, offered this morning sunrise prayers that day and gave me my name in ceremony. He did so with the intention that the moment of my birth be an opportunity to restore ceremony within this urban setting and welcome me into the sacred heart of the greater Native community. That was 40 years ago, and now here we are in commemoration and honor of the 50 years of struggle, resistance, and resilience. So what is it that we have learned, and what is it that we still need to move forward in struggling together? Students today are facing challenges of housing, food shortages, and financial uncertainty. To quote my dear sister, Raha Jorjani, an acclaimed immigration defense attorney, we need to create strategy, fight back, challenge, push, shift, bring people home, raise awareness, advocate, disseminate, empower, protect, connect, love, inspire, and change. That is what we are here to do. And to quote Haley Kushi, we study the injustices of institutions as we seek to join with hopes of bettering them. We look for nuance in the narrative arcs of our histories to understand how we arrived at our current realities. And we investigate what formed our communities in the first place with the hope that we might strengthen them. To tell my family story, I have to talk about my great-great-grandmother that was forced marched to the Round Valley Indian Reservation. She had to escape back home for her survival as so many of our ancestors looked to our sacred mountain, Yetakud, known as Mount Shasta. And in that journey to return home and of survival, my past ancestors had to seek safety in what was known as California's first sanctuaries. During this post-gold rush era, it was a method of survival for us to hide out within ranches and farms. And when you look at me, you wouldn't necessarily consider that I am the daughter and granddaughter of farm workers, a California Indian girl born and raised in both Oakland and the northeastern mountains of California doesn't fit the common perception of someone in the farm worker struggle, or someone in the struggle on behalf of undocumented relatives who married into farm worker families, both Filipino and Mexican families, as a method of survival. We need to change our notions and perceptions, as there is a long-standing history of survival and solidarity between Indigenous communities and tribal communities out of our need to survive in those settler societies. My non-English speaking, non-US citizen grandparents on both sides saw familiarity in one another's spaces and found a common language to communicate, one that was of radical love and survival. They recognized the indigeneity in one another's faces and hearts and birthed 6 Ajumawi and Ilocano boys who all became radicalized, all were freedom fighters, and whose legacy continues today through our children. When we address border militarization and the policing of people from the Americas, we have to recognize that these too are our Indigenous relatives. I have been advocating along with others to develop systems to recognize, support, and provide sanctuary for our Indigenous relatives traveling across false and violent southern borders, because we have to fight to recognize one another, even when we don't appear to be the Indians that society may expect. There is also a younger generation of activists in California that are advocating within tribal communities to provide sanctuary status on tribal lands, recognizing impending threats that affect our own families. These efforts, like the efforts by the Third World Liberation Front 50 years ago here at San Francisco State and on Alcatraz Island, were not only about being visible, it was a demand for full human rights. This is still our struggle, and this is still a call from our ancestors. My children currently go to school in Oakland where ICE raids have occurred within their neighborhoods. What does it look like if my children, who are tribal citizens, are swept up within an ICE raid? Will tribal governments be prepared to advocate for them and have plans set in place in emergency situations? There is a fear from tribal governments, especially right now, within this political climate, and attacks by Trump on tribal sovereignty, that none of us are safe. Tribes are afraid that our lands held in trust with the US government could possibly be seized. The government aims to immobilize us with a fear-based approach, but we need to have these conversations about the realistic situations that our tribal communities face. One narrative and sovereign status is often excluded from national immigration debates. We must affirm that migration for survival in this time of climate crisis is a human right. To quote my late father again, we have been suffering for 500 years of colonization by the US government and American people. And in the spirit of Crazy Horse and Geronimo, we support the demilitarization of the Philippines. I would also add that Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island support the demilitarization of the Philippines, of Palestine, of Puerto Rico, of Hawaii, and of all occupied Indigenous territories. The College of Ethnic Studies plays an important role in Indigenous self-determination. Here we learn about the values and the true stories of our peoples, their struggles, their victories, their resilience, and an ingenuity in order to survive. Here in the College of Ethnic Studies, we can learn of the great achievements in science, architecture, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, philosophy, and societal organization of our ancestors. We can learn of the ways that our ancestors viewed the world and the cosmos, considering the earth as our mother, not as unlimited real estate to be exploited, where we relate to all living beings as our relatives, to live in and with harmony, and not to destroy. We are in a time that we need to address the big green NGOs and other entities that are funded by global capitalism and militarism to contextualize conversations about climate migration and the climate crisis. What we are speaking to is the very survival of Indigenous peoples. The exploitation and destruction of tribal territories and separation of Native families and Black families is that is central to the foundation of this economic system. We need ethnic studies classrooms to teach and empower our young people amidst these conditions. For ethnic studies scholars to teach and practice advocacy for our people that are suffering. The violence against our children, women, and families continues in many insidious ways. Just yesterday, we gathered at City Hall for the 6-month anniversary of the murder of my friend and sister in struggle, herself a mother of 6 children. Jessica Alva was a single mother that made San Francisco her home, and in her memory, I honor her as a freedom fighter and warrior. Our Indigenous women and Two-Spirit relatives are being murdered and disappeared at exponentially increasing rates, as the state of California ranks 5 in the nation, and the city of San Francisco ranks 10th as a city. An overwhelming percentage of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit peoples are survivors of systematic, physical, and sexual gendered violence. When we speak to survivor advocacy, we need to ensure that marginalized voices are uplifted, and that when addressing community needs, and that when we are speaking about vulnerable communities, that we center survivor advocate voices so that well-meaning advocacy is not simply exploitive. How are you lifting these communities? Are you giving more than you are taking? Our elders and culture keepers have sacrificed so much to carry on their stories and narratives, and for us to be here today. And to have the chance to walk this talk for another 50 years. Are we honoring them? Are we taking care of them? Are we working with them? Are our most vulnerable getting the legal support, direct services, direct resources, and culturally appropriate care, along with basic economic and social resources in order to survive. We know that this system does not work for those forced into poverty, funneled into the school-to-prison pipelines, or for survivors of violence and abuse who can be re-victimized by systems that don't provide that support. The community has a responsibility not to uplift abusers, especially in spaces honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there is a great need to create a model template to recognize incarcerated Native peoples and provide appropriate resources for rehabilitation, mental health, and a pathway back into our communities. We are working to end mass criminalization and state violence in order to achieve Indigenous justice. We have an obligation not to be silent or complicit on how these issues, which are both deeply and personally painful, affect our communities in a way that has created this epidemic. It is our duty to seek to enable directly impacted communities to heal from current and historical trauma, to regain hope and agency. So, ethnic studies students, today we aren't here to speak to the obvious, but to the inobvious. To the unique position our relations from abroad fill in this American life, this American nightmare, this great experiment that we know only as genocide and erasure. 50 years ago, they spoke out in simple terms to a world willingly deaf and blind to the obvious, that they mattered. In the movement for Black lives, in swift and all too typical reaction, racist America has responded, yes, but all lives matter. From the same place of ignorance that appoints a vile, crude, lying orange man as his representative of the shining city on the hill, the bastion of civilization, for whom others envy our freedom, between calls to make it great again. For our Black brothers and sisters, they, like we, are born again from the common thread, that root, if you will, of suffering on a tree of oppression. For us, this era of pop fascism isn't new at all. It is the same settler and the same slave driver, the same brutalizer and invader, the same murderer. But where we as unified peoples hold bond in common suffering and common aspirations for life and love, we are as people where we are for wholly different reasons, specifically because under white supremacy, the original first terrorism from the first invaders of our sacred lands. For white supremacist America to continue, it must be fueled by endless Black death. For Indigenous peoples, our struggle isn't to matter, it's for visibility, to even be seen at all. Our existence or lack thereof in American culture is no more obvious than on this day, once a year, every year, with a month-long acknowledgement called Heritage Month.
Oh.
We stand with our brothers and sisters and all our relations in not some oppression or appropriation Olympics, but because when we can, we have always stood with one another in unity, struggle, and resistance. And when we cannot, it is because our common enemy has spun their lies and miseries upon us to put us at one another in opposition. That day is over. Amidst desperation, violence, displacement, trauma, and destruction that we are currently living, there are clear signs of foretold shifts of hope, of cultural consciousness, and reclamation of Indigenous land, sacred sites, and Indigenous self-determination. This day, this next phase begins now. Our next moves will be hand in hand, foot to foot, and fist with powerful fists. Here now, right now, that as we struggle together, as we fight together, as we thrive together, we continue to break those chains. Break the chains on unceded stolen lands, break the chains on this concrete jungle, and so too as we walk with unbroken chains, with motivation, armed with the knowledge earned, to go forth as warriors in service of our Mother Earth and our peoples. Remember, please remember and hear me now. We are here and we continue to exist, and like our elders before us, this fight, this resistance, and this movement only gets stronger. Susuliai, thank you. Close with a prayer here from my dear friend Tomasita, who is also a friend of my father's and a striker here. And so it says, "Beloved Creator, thank you for this day, for our health and our strength, our loved ones, and the friendships you send our way. Thank you for your children's laughter, our parents' wisdom, our loved ones' smiles. Keep us strong in your ways. Guide us to do good each day. Please bless and protect our Mother Earth, the winged and the four-legged, the waters and the mountains, the rock people, and all of our spirit relations. Dear ancestors of these lands, dear ancestors of each and every one of us, we remember you and we love you. Thank you for guiding us and helping us to create a College of Ethnic Studies in this place. Please protect each and every one who comes here seeking to share knowledge, to restore, and to keep our ancestral wisdom alive. Please protect this college. May the elders, the faculty, the students, and the community united thrive. May this college flourish forever." So I think we have time for some Q&A if anyone has any questions or comments. I also want to acknowledge some of my relatives in the room. My Uncle Bruce, who was here 50 years ago as part of the struggle. And my friend Tom Loden, who just graduated this past spring from ethnic. And Tom is working on Alcatraz Island right now and has been very instrumental in a lot of the 50th anniversary activity events, so thank you to both of them.
Freshman here, and I'm learning things that I knew but never knew and never was allowed to know. And in that, I experienced the trauma of all the people that came before me, and I sit with that, and I struggle with that. And in these spaces, I find it hard to be and to cry and to feel that. And I'm curious and need to know how do I hold that, and how do I share that, and how do I let myself cry?
That's such an important question. Thank you. We all hold trauma in our bodies, and we all hold generations of trauma, and that in order to address that and help to heal that is that we need movement. So we need movement in our bodies. We need movement in being able to express ourselves, and so part of within our cultural practices, we take part in a lot of spiritual runs. And so, just having it in us that everyone's a runner, we get up in the morning, we offer our prayers, and we go run. I take my children, and that really helps just in terms of setting the tone for the day. We go on 4 to 5 day runs that we take part with our tribal community and with our outward California Native communities, and so having some sort of practice, some sort of outlet so that you're not holding all of that in is really important. Thank you.
This is one of the things that you talked a lot about, on what basis unity should be. It's not about any kind of unity. It's not all people of color coming together and so on, but on a particular basis. And there is a tension when people say ethnic studies, then people say people of color, and it's supposed to also incorporate indigenous communities and so on. So I was wondering if you can actually elaborate on that a little bit, because that's how we can grow and that's how we can engage with each other and be sensitive to the original people of the land who are still here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that question. So I think that Indigenous, they pushed this it was an over 30-year effort to get the declaration passed. And so anywhere else that you go into the world, other than the US and Canada, that the Indigenous the term of Indigenous is self-identified. Within the US and Canada, it's this colonial construct that has been created where it's dogs, horses, and Native peoples that have to prove their lineage and prove that through the system of federal recognition. And so just as our sister Canyon had talked about the Ramatash and the Ohlone peoples of this land, California is home to 109 tribes that have been afforded federal recognition. There are over 55 tribes that are not afforded federal recognition. So right here you have the San Francisco Bay Area, Sacramento, the LA metropolitan area. It's all completely political. It's all based on prime real estate, and the issue of visibility. It's, the continued erasure of Indigenous peoples. And so, yes, there is, the term BIPOC, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and then Indigenous peoples being labeled under people of color. And so for myself, I just recognize that as I see you as my sister, I see you as my brother, I see you as my two-spirit relative, and that we are all in the struggle together. And so whatever labels and whatever terms and whatever identification that people feel they need to label themselves as, that's important. That's important to them, and that's important to recognize and show that respect. And so for myself, before anything, I'm an Ajumawi person. I'm a Pit River person. I'm tied to the land and the mountains and the streams of where my parents and my grandparents were raised. And then from that, I go on in terms of how I identify myself. So thank you. Yes. Just want to say it really is an honor to be here today with all of you, and thank you so much.